Welcome, everyone, to this side event here at the EU Pavilion, Clean Tech for Net Zero. It's an honor to welcome you. It's an honor to welcome our distinguished guest, Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans for the European Green Deal, U.S. Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm, and the Namibian Presidential Advisor and Hydrogen Commissioner James Minupe. My name is Lee Beck, and I'm the Senior Director for Europe for the Clean Air Task Force. For those of you who don't know us, we're a global climate organization focusing on the overlooked solutions for a zero-carbon future. We're also hosting a pavilion called Zero Carbon Future, a couple of halls over, where we're investigating the hard questions on energy access, energy security, and climate. And so here's what we're going to do today. We're going to have a conversation, opening remarks from our panelists in a conversation, and then I would love for you to engage in the conversation by tweeting at us at #EU at COP27 and at EU Climate Action. And before we dive in, I just want to give a few framing remarks. This COP, of course, comes at a pivotal moment in time. Emissions are still rising. The world is in polycrisis with shifting geoeconomics and geopolitics. And particularly here in Africa, the majority of people are already feeling the effects of climate change. 800 million people still lack access to electricity. 2 of 46 clean energy technologies tracked by the International Energy Agencies are not, only 2 of 46 are actually on track, and 50% of emissions reductions are expected to come from technologies not yet mature. And of course, we're here at the implementation COP. So today it's actually really exciting to talk about the future of clean tech and the exciting progress we have made over the past year. In the US, we had just the first anniversary of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. We also, together with the Inflation Reduction Act, this is forming the biggest climate investment in US history and will put the US on track to achieving 42% of emissions reductions by 2030. The EU and the EU Green Deal, of course, Fit for 55, unprecedented investments via the Innovation Fund. The third large-scale call has recently been launched, and this comes, of course, on track of complementary policies on the member state level and unprecedented, unparalleled track record of commercializing renewables. And these achievements embody the responsibility of the US and Europe to buy down clean tech costs globally. And so from this perspective, we now also have to think about global deployment, because a clean US, a clean Europe is not the end game, it's just the beginning. And so from this perspective, we're really, really excited to hear from you, James, about your vision for indigenous innovation in Namibia, particularly low-carbon hydrogen, as well as the successes here at COP27 in securing more than $500 million in financing. So with this, I'm honored to hand over to you, Executive Vice President Timmermans, for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much. And I have some really wonderful remarks prepared, but I might not turn to them because I have a couple of thoughts to share with you. We need to decarbonize our economy and society, but we don't need to de-industrialize our society. And for countries that are still industrializing, we need to speed up the industrialization without falling into the trap of doing that through more carbon emissions. So this is basically the challenge we face, and the only way we can do that is to speed up the introduction of new technologies, is to make sure we make this energy transition happen very fast. Many of the technologies are already there, some are mature, some are not mature yet. This will warrant huge amounts of investment, and never will public authorities have enough investment money to make that happen. So what we need to do at a time scale that is unprecedented in human history, we need to unleash trillions of investments from all forms, from all spaces, to make sure that we have an opportunity to make this transition happen at the time and at the scale that we need to do it, to stay within the limits we've set ourselves for emissions. The European Union will be able to decarbonize its economy. We will reach climate neutrality in 2050. We have had some encouraging signals, even in this horrible situation of Putin's barbaric war against Ukraine, where we had to scramble to plug the holes of where the energy was missing. We have still been able to increase our targets for energy consumption reduction. We've been able to speed up the introduction of renewables, the transition to renewables, which leads us to the conclusion that already now, on the basis of what we've done in legislation, we still have some legislation to go, we can say that our target to reduce our emissions by at least 55% by 2030 has now moved to at least 57% by 2030. Well, some were saying, well, that's only 2% point. Yeah, but it's substantial. It's 40 megatons of emissions, which is half of the emissions of my own country, the Netherlands, for a year. So, and we will be moving even forward on that in the next months. Now, how do we, so what is, in my view, the sticky point here? Will the technologies be developed? Well, I am amazed. Years ago, I was very, very reluctant to accept the premise that technology will help because, frankly, it was often sort of a fig leaf the oil industry used. By saying, we don't need to decarbonize, there will be technology, we'll suck all that CO2 out of the air through technologies, etc. So that made me very reluctant to accept the argument. But now that I've been doing this, what I'm doing now, for 3 years, I've completely mesmerized with human imagination and ingenuity. The things we can do if we put our minds to it are really incredible. And I see these developments in technologies happening so fast. The problem is to bring that up to scale at the speed we need investments as we've never seen before. Now, we're doing our best. I think IRA is the Inflation Reduction Act is extremely good news. I really, really want to commend President Biden and the US administration for getting that done. There are some issues we will need to discuss and to make sure that we don't enter into a trade conflict over that, and I think that can be solved. But the more important thing is this will unleash so much investment that the transition will happen faster than before. Now, how do we then apply the same logic to countries that do not have to re-industrialize as we do, US and EU, but are still industrializing? I think we need to speed up the transition of technologies. I think we need to speed up the transformation of the international financial world, IMF, World Bank, but also the MDB, so that they can have this leverage effect on investment that we've seen also elsewhere. I think we need to share the technologies much faster than we're doing right now. We need to create economic and industrial value chains across continents, and for Europe that especially applies to our relationship with Africa. And I'm really keen to hear from you, James, what Namibia is doing, because we've seen Namibia moving at lightning speed on hydrogen and green ammonia. I know several European countries who are really keen to work with you on this. And I would love to hear from you what this means for the transformation of your society and how you see this going forward. Because, and I'll end on this, because the last thing I want is for our needs in renewable energy to take away the production capacity in Africa of renewable energy. I want us to be sure that when we collaborate with Africa on this, when we take hydrogen from Africa, which we need to do because we will never be able to produce enough hydrogen ourselves, we do this on the basis of renewable energy that is produced in excess of what Africa needs itself, and not be in competition with Africa's own needs. That would be the worst possible situation. And I would love to hear from James how he thinks we can achieve that, because I hope we're on the same page as far as that's concerned. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Executive Vice President Timmermans. Secretary Granholm.
If I should just defer, because he set up these great questions for James, and I can go after James, because I thought they were a great series. So would you go?
I'm happy. Cool. So I love the fact that we have to be nimble, right? When we're here. So I have actually prepared some written statements, because I'd actually love to take you guys on a bit of a journey of how all this unfolded. So throwback to the 18th of March 2021, our president launches what we are calling back home the Harambee Prosperity Plan 2. So our socioeconomic recovery plan post-COVID, your IRA, your EU 55 project. And in June 2021, we went on a roadshow in Europe. essentially Europe for us was a big burgeoning market that was really articulating its need for synthetic fuels. We realized that we had the renewable energy potential, and I remember I was invited to the launch of the world's first multimodal hydrogen service station in Antwerp. That's where I met you. So Frans Timmermans was a key speaker there, and I was sitting there with our ambassador to the EU, and he sat at the table next to us, and she goes, "That's Frans Timmermans." I'm like, "Who's that?" She says he's only the biggest deal in hydrogen. I'm like, "Oh, okay, cool." So like, we should go say hi, and she's like, "No, it's Frans." I'm like, "Okay." So I had 2 copies of the HPP2 left. So I took one out, and we scribbled a message in there, and we said, to Frans Timmermans with love from the Namibian president. And you have to realize on the cover of this report, there's a green hydrogen molecule. And of course, most people in Namibia at the time didn't know what that was, but the president had the courage to trust us to put that on the cover. So I go to Frans Timmermans, I give him a copy, and I had a pamphlet of like what we want to do. Little did I know, in his sort of key address, he mentions Namibia 4 times. And then later that day, I think our ambassador tweeted that we were there, and then he retweeted that, and she lost it, right? So if Makonja's watching, sorry, she really did almost lose it. And so I guess my key message today is that partnerships don't always have to come in the form of really, really complex policy documents or billions of euros, but they sure do help. Because really, since that day, our journey has picked up so much momentum. 18 months later, we've mobilized about 6% of GDP in concessional climate financing, over $130 million in grant funding, and the $500 million concessionary grant facility, essentially, or let's call it a framework loan from the European Investment Bank. And this is after President von der Leyen signed an MOU with my president. So this was on Wednesday. Our Namibian pavilion is about half the size of the stage. And on that day, there were like people queuing outside, right? Like trying to see what was going on. And that wouldn't have happened without Mr. Timmermans here retweeting us, but without the EU really working closely with us to develop what we're developing today. So what are we developing? After we met on the president's 80th birthday, he kills me every time I mention we did this on his 80th birthday. But the 3rd of August, he turned 80, and so we launched a global request for proposal, a global tender. And we asked people from around the world to bid to develop a multi-gigawatt green hydrogen project in Namibia. And the preferred bidder, whom we are really, really close to signing an implementation agreement, essentially put together a proposal which today looks like more than $11 billion for the capex, 6.5 gigawatt of renewable electricity assets, 300,000 tons of green hydrogen, and potentially 2.1 million tons of ammonia, with potential off-takers in Europe. The German Vice Chancellor is actually coming to Namibia on the 4th of December to talk about off-take packages and bringing industry to Namibia, right? And so practically, that's how you make all of this work. Close partnerships, but really working closely with industry as well. Now, all of this is happening, and if we look at the amount of land that's available in Namibia to deploy assets like these, we could probably put together a pipeline of more than $100 billion, because we could do about 7 to 10 hyphens across our country. But we're very focused on executing diligently on delivering bankable projects and not just, like really dreamy visions. And so what do we want to do next? So the first thing we want to do is we're setting up actually a green hydrogen commission. The Dutch have given us 3 million euros to do that. And so we're doing that under the presidency, essentially a dedicated unit that will look at monitoring and delivering these projects. We're signing an implementation agreement with Hyphen pretty soon. And then, of course, we want to put together a Synthetic Fuels Act. So a dedicated piece of legislation that will essentially incubate a synthetic fuels industry in Namibia. And then most importantly, given the topic, we actually launched a Namibian Green Hydrogen Research Institute, which essentially saw 2 of our top tertiary institutions coming together. And the idea is for us to really start investing significantly in R&D and really looking to build and deploy patents and products that we're going to be using in our own country. And then, of course, the good news is we don't really have to do this alone. I'm in extremely good company today. And so one of the things we've learned from the Europeans is it's extremely important to diversify your partners as well, right? So that you don't end up in really, really sticky situations from an energy security perspective. And so while Europe has been fantastic, we have actually started engaging with the Japanese, for example, which we think are a very strategic market for the products that we want to make. And we signed an MOU with Jogmek at TICAD in Tunisia in August. And I can see some of our friends are sitting right here at the front, actually. And so we're looking to go to Japan in January and really looking at developing that as a potential offtake market. And then, of course, we started talking to the US. Your embassy back home is super, super diligent. And we're looking to talk to you more about how we can work with the US when we visit Washington between the 13th and the 15th of December for the African Leadership Summit. So I think partnerships are important. And then the last thing I'll just say is, look, there are a lot of innovative tools that both Europe and the US are working on. For example, whether it's a carbon border adjustment mechanisms or the carbon for contracts difference. Of course, we're working closely with the Germans on H2 Global, and I'd love to see how you want to deploy the resources on the hydrogen bank, right? But the key thing there is if we deploy these tools strategically, we can actually create diversified new markets for strategic energy resources around the world, which not only would usher in a more diversified and secure global energy ecosystem, super important, but also tackle systemic industrialization mismatches, which is exactly what we have today. And we can do that head on. So our invite is to say, look, we have some ideas, let's talk. Bring us to the table as you design these very consequential solutions for the world. Because the African philosophy of Ubuntu means that I am because you are, right? And so we have to work together in order to essentially provide a world for our kids that our forefathers would be super proud of, but that we can look forward to and know that we did something to really, really combat climate change, holding hands together. So I look forward to the dialogue, and thanks a lot for having me. Cheers.
Super interesting. Thanks, James. So interesting to hear your story, and the title is you are the Energy Minister for Hydrogen. What's the title? It's
Some people back home would kill you. I'm just a presidential economic advisor, and
wasn't there a hydrogen in there?
I'm the Green Hydrogen Commissioner for Namibia. I think we're the only green hydrogen commission in Africa.
Yeah,
so.
I hadn't heard of that title before, so it's such an important specialty as we consider what is going to provide us with a key solution, not the only solution, but a key solution to getting to a net zero world. So thanks for sharing that. In our situation in the United States, when the president came in and he wanted to set big goals, obviously there was this commitment that we wanted to meet, which was net zero by 2050, and then by 2035, get to 100% clean electricity. So you set big goals, you have to measure backwards, and how are you going to get there? And so the policy follow-up was a way to be able to reach those big goals. There are three big pieces, really. The Inflation Reduction Act is one, and thank you, Lee, for mentioning as well, the bipartisan infrastructure law. Who cares about all these titles? Really, the agenda itself is centered on three big pieces of legislation. The first one is a year old now as of yesterday. So we're starting to see some of the results of the passage of that. And the first one, this bipartisan infrastructure law, allows for us to do direct grants in partnership with companies to incentivize the kinds of technologies that we want to see flourish. Hydrogen, clean hydrogen being one of them. Next generation batteries, advanced nuclear, et cetera. We have a whole suite of technologies that we wanted to make sure that we were in public-private partnership with. Of course, in the United States, we don't have state-owned enterprises, so that's the way we get the private sector in the game. And as a result, just as one quick example on the hydrogen side, we did a request for proposal, or a funding opportunity announcement is what we call it. And the amount of money that we did in this first tranche was for $7 billion. That's what what we wanted to do was to create a series of hydrogen hubs across the country using different inputs and different offtakes, and to see what would happen. So as a result of this first suite, we got 79 serious proposals for hubs. Now, we don't have enough money to fund. In fact, there was probably $60 billion worth of money that was requested for the $7 billion that we have. And that required that match. And so it's really about $210 billion worth of demand that was out there for this first tranche. So we're excited to see, we just got them back, so we haven't made decisions yet. We're going to winnow them down and have a conversation with those who applied. But we're interested in all sorts of inputs. So part of the legislative requirement from that required hydrogen to come from natural gas as one example. And of course, because we want it to be clean hydrogen, those who are applying have to have taken care of the CO2 issues and the methane issues. Another one was we have to have hydrogen based upon nuclear, and then the rest on renewables. So we'll see what comes to that, but we expect that there will be 8 to 10 hydrogen hubs in the United States as a result, and we'll see what happens, right? Some of them will, I'm sure, be interested in proposing ammonia. Some of them will be used for heavy industry, but we're just going to be interested. And part of this issue is, what is the offtake? Who are going to be requesting this source of fuel? So that's the first. The bipartisan infrastructure law, as I mentioned, did a whole suite of technologies. But hydrogen, we just got back the results, so that was top of mind. And since we're talking about hydrogen, the second law was called the CHIPS Act, which was really to incentivize microchips in the United States. It really is we want to be able to build the electric vehicles, and like other countries do as well, but we had we were vulnerable in terms of microchip fab facilities in the United States. So we incentivized the building of those. And that law also authorized billions of dollars to be invested in our research and development enterprise, which comes through the Department of Energy. We have 17 national laboratories that are all working on these solutions. And so that's sort of the brains of this suite of legislation. And then the third piece is the Inflation Reduction Act, which again incentivizes through tax credits the private sector to get in the game. That was passed in August. Since that was passed, we've had about $30 billion worth of companies investing $30 billion announcements because of those investments. So for example, if you get a 30% tax credit, if you are manufacturing solar panels and if you're manufacturing solar panels in the United States, you get a 40% tax credit if you are located in a disadvantaged community. You get another 10% if you're paying prevailing wage. In other words, they're good paying jobs. So that'd be up to 50% tax credit to be able to do that. We had lost so much, like I think Europe has struggled with this too, so much of our industrial base. And so we wanted to create that industrial backbone for our energy security as well as for our economic security. So that's an example. Those are called investment tax credits. And then we also have production tax credits. So 30% for solar production, 30% for wind, et cetera. And in fact, it's somewhat technology neutral, agnostic, as long as it's zero carbon emitting. So those that suite of three really gives us the ability to get the private sector in the game, which is really important if we need trillions of dollars of investment going forward. So we're very excited about this and collaboration. Because we cannot do it without partnering and without learning from one another. I'll be super interested to see how your push, especially on the green ammonia, et cetera, from hydrogen plays out, so that we can all learn from one another as we pursue these really important experiments.
Yeah, thank you so much for these wonderful opening statements. Really incredible progress this year. I actually want to have a follow-up question for you, Secretary Granholm. Especially we're talking speed of deployment, R&D centers being opened in Namibia. DOE has a 40-year history of a primary R&D agency, and now you're really focusing on, as you like to say, deploy, deploy, deploy. So how has this changed your mission? How fast are you going to be able to deploy these technologies?
Yeah, I mean, the Department of Energy, to your point, really has spent the past 40 years on research and development and smaller scale demonstration. And that's all in partnership with these national labs that are doing fantastic work. So now, through this bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we are exercising a new muscle, which is big scale, large scale deployment. And so we have reorganized our whole effort to add a whole new undersecretary for infrastructure that is going to create a center of excellence around large scale deployments. And so, for example, we also just announced the battery. We want to be able to build out the full supply chain for batteries for electric vehicles, and so we funded a series of the suite: the anode, the cathode, the separator material, the electrolyte. We want that built in the United States. So we had a series of funding opportunity announcements. We just announced that 20 companies got those funds in 14 different states across the country. Some of them in areas where they're creating sort of a hub of those technologies. We need to make sure that as we are demonstrating these big investments, that we have folks who are project managers who understand, and we're working with the private sector, but who understand the whole suite of supply chain issues, including the workforce issues, including making sure that we have community benefit agreements so that the communities in which these investments will sit are part of benefiting from it. So the president has a big investment or a big commitment to Justice 40, which means that 40% of the investments of all of these from his agenda should go to communities that are either frontline communities, disadvantaged communities, communities that are in transition from having been producers of fossil fuels. So all of that, there's a lot of place-based strategy inside of the expanded capabilities of the Department of Energy.
Thank you so much, Secretary Granholm. I want to dive into this kind of reimagination of global fuels market that we're playing out between the EU and Namibia. So maybe you talked trillions of dollars or euros of investments in unleashing innovative technologies. You talked earlier this week about the need for decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors. So how are you going to see this play out with importing fuels and really changing the fuels markets? Maybe we can start with you, Executive Vice President.
Well, it's obvious that in Europe we've been burnt quite literally by our over-dependency on Russian gas mainly, but also oil. And, once bitten, twice shy. This is never going to happen to us again. And the only way we're in a different position than the United States because we don't have our own fossil fuels. Very limited gas resources, coal's almost gone, almost no oil. So the only way we can increase our sovereignty, as it were, in the energy sector is by increasing the production of renewable energy through mainly wind and solar. Because we also have to keep our industry, modernize our industry, bring it into the fourth industrial revolution. For that, you will need a lot of energy, and that will not just be electricity because you can't electrify everything. So for the difficult to abate sectors, we will need an alternative to fossil fuels, and hydrogen is that alternative. Ammonia can also be it. I think, for instance, global shipping is going to shift very quickly to ammonia in the next generation, which is also an enormous opportunity for Namibia, by the way. So I think we sometimes even lack the imagination to understand how fundamentally the world will change when we move away from fossil fuels, or when the role of fossil fuels in our global energy mix will be substantially reduced. Because then energy will be accessible everywhere where there is sun and wind in sufficient capacity, and will no longer depend on whether you have something underground. Which means that also in geostrategic terms, the relationship between nations will fundamentally change, obviously. Russia being the one example we suffered under, but there are other examples of where you could be at the mercy of countries who control resources. Well, that cannot happen with renewables, because also on the basis of renewables and on the basis of where renewables will be able to produce so much electricity that goes way beyond the necessities of the nations where it is produced. All these nations can be part of this new commodity market, which is based on hydrogen and on other synthetic gases. So that will change not just the way we develop. It will not just reduce our emissions. It will not just be better for our economy. It will not just create new jobs. It will also change our geostrategic and security situation with less risks. There will be new risks, but they will be of a lesser level than we have now. And I think this is a good thing for, on all scores, it's a good thing for humanity. And I'm sorry to bang on about this, but for Africa, this is essential. Because I know I have many discussions with African leaders who say, don't prevent us from using our fossil fuels. And I tell them, I don't want to prevent you from using your fossil fuels. And especially on natural gas, for some time you will probably need it to industrialize it, to keep your industry going. But the only way you're ever going to get all 600 million Africans who today have no access to electricity on an electricity grid is through renewables. You can bring solar panels and wind turbines to the most remote villages in Africa, and you will empower the people there in a way that is today almost unimaginable. And you will bring especially women into a situation that they don't have to, carrying their baby on their back, burn wood or charcoal to cook their food, which is a huge health hazard and creates many, many unhealthy situations today. That will be over. Just imagine how a fundamental change that will be. And it's happening before our eyes if we are bold enough to invest fast enough.
Thank you so much. And I want to go over to you, James. Actually, two questions. Kind of elaborate on Namibia-centric vision for energy access, but also what do you need to really become a zero-carbon fuels provider at scale?
Like, it's fascinating when I sit here and I listen to, Jessica's deploying, I think, like a $500 billion program. Namibia, for context, our annual revenue is $3 billion. Our GDP is about $12 billion. There are 2.5 million people. It's a pretty big country, though. It's 2.5 times the size of Germany. So we have a lot of space. We're the second least populated country in the world. To give you a few more pieces of just context, our total installed capacity is just over 650 megawatts. And our energy consumption is 4.5 terawatt hours. Okay, so scale of who Namibia is and where we are. And at the moment, we're importing 60 to 70% of our energy needs from the Southern African power pool. But like what Franz is saying is true. What we want to do gives us an opportunity to actually become energy self-sufficient. First of all, so the project that we're looking to develop should deploy assets that can generate up to 21 terawatt hours of electricity. Okay, we're going to be curtailing 4 to 4.5 of those throughout the life of the project. So the idea is to install significant battery and turn some of that curtailed power into dispatchable power, and then start feeding ourselves extremely cheap energy. We currently buy electricity from the SAPP for anywhere between 9 to 12 US cents a kilowatt hour. The cost of the energy that we're going to generate from these projects is anywhere between 2 to 3 cents a kilowatt hour, possibly less, given the scale and given the amount of concessionary financing we may be able to deploy. So first things first, just like what Mr. Timmermans was saying, of course we'd love to give the molecules to Europe, but at the same time, if we're giving molecules to Europe, but only 40% of people in Namibia have access to energy, that doesn't make sense, right? So get cheap electrons from these hydrogen projects into your grid aspiration. Hey, become the first country in Africa to become 100% green with a grid. That opens up a whole slew of manufacturing opportunities where, we already produce some of the finest zinc in the world, 99.x% purity. If we can start making green zinc, we have iron ore in Namibia. We can start making hot briquetted iron. We start to turn the molecules into complex, clean products, which we can then export around the world, and that creates a really interesting industrialization opportunity for us. So that's me being a bit selfish and looking at Namibia. But if I look at the region, we import electricity from the Southern African power pool, and our neighbor which is a significant carbon emitter around the world. I think the 13th largest in the world, and contributes to 40% of the continent's carbon emissions in South Africa. They sell us 40% of our electricity, but 25% of the time, they're in load shedding. My sister lives in South Africa, right? It's become a way of living. If we could become a regional exporter of those electrons through transmission grids that exist, right? That we already get electricity from them, but it's coal-fired power. If we can give them back renewable electricity, that will be a new business for us, but it'll contribute to regional security. And of course, we import a lot of goods from South Africa, so those goods could become even cheaper. And then, of course, we have aspirations to export molecules, or certainly trade molecules, between us and South Africa. South Africa have a green hydrogen strategy of their own in Boegoebaai. And just as, how do you decarbonize Germany? You do it through Antwerp, Rotterdam, and Hamburg, right? The molecules don't all have to be generated in Germany or come from Germany. So the way you decarbonize South Africa is through Boegoebaai, through Saldanha, but also through Lüderitz and through Walvis Bay in Namibia, right? Because that's where a lot of the renewable energy resources sit. So, if you're talking about what we need to make this come true, of course, getting the molecules to Europe is a big part of that, because you need to earn the money to build the infrastructure. If I go to Jennifer and I say, hey, look, we need to study the viability of building a 2,300 kilometer pipeline from Lüderitz to Boegoebaai and potentially to Secunda, so we can get clean molecules to Sasol, and it's going to cost us X hundreds of millions of dollars, and I've got zero. By the way, when we started this whole thing, we had a zero budget. In fact, we still have a zero budget for green hydrogen. You have half a trillion.
Just for green hydrogen, for the whole.
For the whole thing, right? But that's an easy way we can collaborate, right? And we can work with the EU as well, because one of the things we've learned is the way to decarbonize the world is to decarbonize emissions globally, not just locally, right? So that's an easy way. I think what Germany and Netherlands and the EU in general have done as well is they've provided us with the funding to really get going. So the 40 million euros that we got from Netherlands, we're actually using that to seed Africa's first blended financing infrastructure fund. And we're going to raise 100 million for the development fund, and then we're going to put through a pipeline of projects to develop them to FID. And once we get to financial close, the 500 million that has been availed by the EIB, we're actually going to have a construction fund. We're looking to raise $1 billion for that, $1 billion. And it's actually going to have 3 tranches. And one of the tranches is a debt concentrated fund. We want to put that money into that fund. And what asset are we bringing to the fund? The Namibian government has actually negotiated a 24% equity stake in this multi-billion-dollar green hydrogen project. Truth is, we've never negotiated a stake like that for any of these big energy projects, right? Normally we get 10% free carry if you're lucky. We are going to own a quarter of this 13 billion euro project, right? And that's why the signature took a little bit long. But lastly, what I will say is that allows us to actually deploy pension fund money in Namibia to actually invest in a project like this, and really then begin to share the economics of this opportunity as broadly as we can with all Namibians. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. The Europeans are helping us a lot to de-risk this by also providing some offtake guarantees that lowers your cost of capital, and of course it lowers your levelized cost of ammonia or hydrogen, etc. So that's how we're looking to go about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this really insightful answer on kind of the future of energy in Namibia. I want to go to the audience in just a second, so please everyone get ready with your questions. But I do want to do one lightning round with the panel, and this is, we're gathering a lot of learnings from these investment in next-gen tech deployment. What are the most important avenues we're going to be sharing these learnings globally?
Again, I think we need to concentrate on dimension and speed, because that's where the decisive factor will be. The technologies are developing, but they're not being brought to scale at the speed we need. The finances are there, but we don't have the dimension of finance that we need. So those will be the 2 points where we will put all our efforts in the coming years.
For us, because we have been such a science-based department, I'll just speak from our department, we are really focused on how do you make renewable as dispatchable as possible, which would be, of course, long-duration storage. We have a series of energy earth shots that are like moon shots, but we call them earth shots, that over the next 10 years we want to see these technologies be brought to scale and affordable so that they can be dispatchable, and not just dispatchable, but usable throughout the world. And so for us, our focus at the Department of Energy is really on whether it's enhanced geothermal, which is beneath our feet, but also is renewable, enhanced geothermal, next generation, the long-duration storage, hydrogen, clean hydrogen, making sure that we have industrial heat, really industrial heat processes that reduce CO2 emissions by 85%, really important. Offshore floating wind platforms, so you can go really far out, really important. So those are the kinds of things that we're focusing on to make available and to democratize technology.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's super important to realize that actually Namibia has a lot to offer for the just energy transition. So we've spoken about renewables and the molecules as well. But Namibia likely has some of the largest deposits outside of China for critical raw minerals. And so actually part of the partnership and the MOU that we signed with the EU is to actually explore how we can responsibly find and extract the critical raw minerals, including some rare earths that we need for the energy transition, but then add value to those at home, right? So imagine a scenario where Namibia can actually extract the rare earths, make the magnets in Namibia, send them off to Europe, put those in a turbine, get the Europe from turbine, use that to make some ammonia or synthetic e-kerosene, get that into a plane in Europe, and then bring some tourists back into Namibia, right? So you get it, right? So the idea is let's engage in opportunities that really deepen and widen trade more than just, sort of provide resources to developed nations. And I think the president, in his delivery of a speech at the United Nations General Assembly in 2020, September 2020, he said, we're going to transform the Namibian economy using innovative financial tools. So I've spoken about those. And the last is to say we have to champion African-led R&D to get this done, which is why we formed the NGHRI, but also why some of the funding that we've gotten, we've actually pushed into pilot projects in Namibia. And for each of those pilot projects, we're actually planting students, both Namibians and students from abroad, into the pilot projects to start learning how to convert engines, right? So that they can use dual fuel, both diesel and hydrogen, etc. We want to learn to develop patents at home as well. We do have some of those natural resources, and we have some really bright kids. So the one last thing I'll say is we've then developed a digital nomad visa, right? To make it very easy for all of you all to come to NAM or work from wherever you are to help us craft these really cool patents and new products. So that Namibia really begins to move up the merit order from a primary and an extractive-based sort of society to manufacturing in terms of the secondary, and then, of course, later on to the services and tertiaries industry, where we can also share our learnings with other nations from the emerging markets. So that's sort of the play.
Great, thank you. So I think we have time for one audience question right here.
Hi, Rafiq Latta from Energy Intelligence. Great to see such a common purpose among all the delegates. I wouldn't like to be sort of an anti-Cupid, but I would just appreciate a bit of insight as to some of the tensions that the IRA is creating, maybe with Europe as in terms of trade issues, and this very interesting idea of creating your own supply chain, i.e. the protectionist aspect of it, and how this is getting worked out. Thank you.
Well, the IRA is a subject for discussion between the US and the EU. We both understand that our strategic partnership is more important than ever before, and the transatlantic ties are stronger than ever before. Our common purpose in resisting autocracy and defending liberties and democracy is strong and unbreakable. And on that basis, I believe that we can also find common ground on issues where perhaps today we still have unclarity of where we are. And if I can be allowed to say this, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, the IRA is also quite a complex a bit of legislation where we need to sort of unpick it and look at it specifically, what it means. What does it mean for the EV industry? What does it mean for the battery industry? What could be Europe's role in all of that? How can we, and we use different fora to have a discussion about that, because from where I'm standing, we cannot afford to end into trade conflicts with our most important partner in security matters, in how we see society, and how we see liberty, how we see democracy, and that puts a huge responsibility on our shoulders to come out of this with agreements that could allow us to trade, that could allow us to see common ground, and perhaps also develop some common projects.
Very well said.
Great. And with this, we're at time. I just want to give a short recap of the conversation. Executive Vice President Timmermans, you said that sometimes it's hard for us to envision this completely decarbonized future energy system. But what I want to say about this conversation with your perspectives, I think it's actually possible. We've heard about the differences that each country, each region will need different technology portfolios. We've heard carbon capture, nuclear, hydrogen, the future of global fuels markets, that we need technology optionality. And of course, for this to happen, we need to act with speed. We need to unleash trillions to bring these technologies to scale. Unparalleled collaboration. We need to deepen and widen trade, as you said, James. And then I think, Secretary Granholm, you made a very, very important point about the future of workforce and the ecosystem we need to create in terms of education and training to ensure that we're really delivering as soon as possible an energy systems transformation. So with this, I want to thank you all for joining for this really important conversation on clean tech for net zero. The audience, thank you so much for joining us.